one of the most important tools for any painter is their brush. So when it comes to buying a brush, it can be a little overwhelming when you first start out. In the brush aisle, there's loads of different kinds of brushes. I'm here today to hopefully clear up some of this and show you what to look for in a brush. To start out, let's look at the anatomy of a brush. Let's start at the bottom and work our way up. I'm sure you can guess what this part is. It's the handle. It really doesn't matter how long or how short your brush is. That's more of just a personal preference. The important thing about the handle is not only it allows you to hold it, but it tells you the brand of the brush and also the size of the brush. Above the handle is this metal piece called the ferrule. This is the piece of the brush that attaches the hairs to the handle of the brush. One of its main purposes is to protect the glue or the epoxy that holds the hair in from deteriorating after repeated cleanings. Above the ferrule is what most people refer to as the brush. These are the hairs that pick up and hold the paint until you release it, putting it down on the canvas or the paper. Hairs can be made up of natural or synthetic hairs. More on this later. The bottom of the hairs is called the belly, and at the end, here you guessed it, the tip. Now we're mainly going to focus on the hair or the brush part of it. You'll see them labeled in different sizes. This refers to the width, not the length of the hairs. The smaller size brushes, below size 4, are usually for detail work. Medium sizes, 4 to 6, are for small areas. And large size brushes, above 6, are for broad spaces. But what about the overall shapes of the brush? Well, here you go. One of the most common types of brushes is the round brush. They're really good for detail work and putting in some lines. You can create different line weights or different sizes of the lines, the thickness, dependent on the pressure that you put on it. These are the types of brushes that I use 99% of the time unless I'm trying to fill in a large area. Next up we have flat brushes. The larger flat brushes are excellent for applying a large amount of area, and also if you're trying to put in the initial wash of water, you can just go ahead and stroke that on. These have squared edge, so they're easier to create a hard edge shape when applying paint. I mainly use the flat brushes when I'm trying to apply washes of color or trying to put in some transparent layers of color. Filberts come in somewhere between a flat and a round brush. The key difference between a filbert and a flat is their rounded edges. Filbert brushes are great all around and can be very versatile. The name of this brush kind of gives it away. It allows you to do fine lines in your artwork or when you're putting in your little details. These are great little brushes to add detail to your work, such as grasses and branches and landscapes. Another great use of this brush is when it's time to sign your name. Next we have angled brushes. These are kind of like flat brushes, but somebody took a knife and cut it at an angle. They are great at making thick lines and then turning it to move to a thinner line. The last brush that we're going to be covering is a fan brush. It's called a fan brush because it looks like your normal hand fans that you use on a hot day. The bristles are generally thinner, not heavily layered to avoid packing up too much pigment. These brushes are great for blending colors together, but equally useful for adding textures. The brushes can help create a stippling effect when the pigment is applied to the surface in a tapping motion. Fan brushes are great for hairs, trees, and texture in landscapes. There are more brushes out there, such as the dagger brush, the mottler brush, and the bright brushes. But these ones are not as common when you're first starting out. If I had to give some advice for just starting out or going out into the stores to get some typical brushes that you may need when you're painting, I'd recommend doing a round brush and a filbert brush. Those are some of the most common types of brushes that you'll be using. Depending on the canvas that you'll be using, size of the brush is totally a personal preference. For most of my artworks I use either a 4 or a 6 type brush. Finally, let's talk about the composition of the brush. more along the lines of what types of hairs to look for or are available when you're out there buying brushes. For the most part, natural brushes are softer and tend to hold the most paint on the brush. These brushes are typically going to be more expensive. Why, you ask? Because they have to remove the hair from an actual animal to produce them and are generally handmade type brushes. Synthetic brushes are made from synthetic fibers or created in the lab, such as nylon. Synthetic brushes have defined points and are better at holding their shape over time. They're generally a little stiffer than natural hair. Naturally, the synthetic brushes are going to be cheaper because they can be mass-produced for a lot less. The downside is they have a shorter lifespan than natural brushes, as their fibers eventually fray apart. So what does all this mean to you if you're just starting out? Well, it depends. What does it depend on? Well, how much money you have to spend. If you can afford natural hair brushes, I would highly recommend them. The reason is that they last longer and typically hold the paint better. With that said, do you need them? Well, the answer is no. The synthetic brushes are more cost-effective and you can create beautiful pieces of artwork using them. With modern technology, they can make synthetic brushes almost the same as natural hair brushes due to modern technology. And that's a plus because then you can buy them for a fraction of the cost. My final piece of advice to sum all of this up is this. Go out to the store, get a few brushes. It doesn't matter if they're expensive or inexpensive. Just find out what works for you. I promise you this, you can't go wrong with any type of brush. Next up in the series is the different types of watercolor paper and how to choose the right one to use.